I wanted to take a minute today at the beginning of the podcast and say thank you to our sponsor, Huber Engineered Woods. Huber has actually been a sponsor of the podcast since 2020 when we decided to start this little endeavor. Without our sponsors, this content is probably not something that happens. But I think the best part about having Huber as a partner on this is it's an incredibly authentic alignment. Peter, Steve, and I all use Huber Woods. I've been using Advantech Subfloor for coming on probably 21 years now. I've been using Zip System and Zip System with the insulation on the back, the Zip R, since 2013. It's a system that I believe in. That systems approach where things play well together. They have design parameters that allow you to use their system for what you're working on. It works. Their tech support's there. Their knowledge is there. I've never had an issue with their product, and it's a great thing that they've decided to sponsor the podcast. So thank you, Huber Engineered Woods.
Welcome to the Unbuilt It podcast. I'm your host this week, or for this episode, Pete Yost, and I'm here with just my good buddy, Jake Bruton.
Hello, hello.
So why is that? Well, once again, Steve has shown up late for the recording studio, and so we're going to call this episode, It's All About Steve. Just ask him.
He'll tell you.
He'll tell you, yeah. So actually, this is going to be a bit of a tribute to Steve, because despite all the ribbon we give each other, we work together because we like each other and we admire each other's work. So, Jake, why don't you start off with how I met Steve?
So we're both in the same lineup. No. I had a client. We were finishing up a renovation in 2012, 2013.
Is this in Columbia, Missouri?
Yeah. And it was a renovation on like a condo that they owned. And they were renovating it because they were wanting to make it a little nicer so that they could sell it in like the next year. And the plan was they were going to sell it because they were thinking about building a house. And she was writing me the final check as we were like cleaning up grout. And she said, "Hey, we're thinking about building a passive house. We're really happy with everything you guys did here. Is that something you guys would be interested in being involved with?" And I literally...
It's a happy client.
And I said, absolutely. That's something we could handle for you. We would totally be interested in that. Let me do a little bit of looking for architects that we might want to work with, and we can talk next week. And I went home and used Google to figure out what passive house was, because I didn't know, and I'd not heard the term before in 2013. And that was the point at which Steve was working with Fine Home Building on Dan Roy's house in Falmouth.
Yeah.
And they were starting to publish the series on Dan's house. And they were doing, I found a foundation video that had just published, and Steve was talking about sill plate details. And I literally thought, I don't know an architect that understands how buildings go together better than this architect just explained in the last 10 minutes. And I called his I cold called him.
Wow.
And he answered the phone. And I thought, might be a small firm, like he might be a one-man show, so that's not like that extraordinary. And I said, I have a client who asked about passive house, and I found this video series you're working on with Fine Home Building, and I'm interested in talking to you about it. And he said, sure, I have the one going in Falmouth, and we have one going out on the vineyard. You should just bring your clients out for the weekend, and we'll go out to the vineyard and see a couple passive houses.
That is just precious.
And I literally thought, yeah, that's a thing that I do, is I take clients to Martha's Vineyard for the weekend. And so I called the clients and I said, hey, this architect is the preeminent expert on passive house in the United States. He knows what he's talking about. He's probably who we should work with. We should go to Martha's Vineyard for a visit and check out these houses. And the client said, okay.
That is.
And I immediately, when she said, okay, I went, oh, who pays for this? I hadn't considered. Like, I was 6 years into owning the business, and I obviously the clients pay for it, but I hadn't really put two and two together yet. I hadn't thought that they were going to say
it was your idea. So
it was like when I called and asked my wife out, and I said, "Do you want to go out Thursday night?" And she said, "No." And my brain hadn't thought about what happens if she says no to start. The follow up is my wife went, "Thursday night is Christmas Eve." And I went, "Oh, crap." Like, I'm that level of dumb. I don't think ahead. So then we went to Martha's Vineyard, and we were riding the ferry from Falmouth out to the vineyard. The client got up to go take a phone call, and Steve pulled a set of plans out and rolled it out. And there were 1-to-1 scale drawings of a sill plate detail with sealant on them. Mm-hmm. And I went, "Oh, this is going to be the architect that I want to work with."
The funny thing about that story is that Steve tells the same story about the first client that asked him about Passive House, and he went, "Oh yeah," and then went to take a bathroom break and was Googling Passive House. So I met Steve because I was working at Building Green in Brattleboro, and had come from the NEHB Research Center where they did all contract research, and here I am working for a publisher, and Joe and Betsy at Building Science Corporation were looking for contract researchers that had a background in building green, because they were trying to figure out the relationship between green building and building science. And so my name had come up a couple of times, and my brother Nathan is involved in the story, but that's separate. But the point here is that I wanted to get back to contract research, and the way to do that was to go work with Joe and Betsy. And so I had an amicable splitting up with Building Green at that point. But my first project full time, I'd worked with them sort of part-time distance over the summer, was in September of 2001. And we actually were scheduled to fly to Cleveland, Ohio for a project Steve was working on 2 days after 9/11. And of course, we weren't going to fly. So Betsy says, "Okay, Steve's going to meet you in Western Massachusetts, and you guys are going to go for a 3-day trip to Cleveland." Had no idea who Steve was, never seen him before. And of course, I get to the meeting spot with him where we agreed to meet in Western Mass, and this guy gets out of the car. And I thought, he doesn't really look like the architect I was expecting. So we have these long drives to and from Cleveland. And Steve's background in the military was he was a professional driver. He was a trained driver of all kinds of different type of equipment. And so he's really good at driving long distances. But particularly coming home, because we were driving mostly at night and overnight, the way that Steve stays awake when he's driving is he plays country music like super loud. So when I was trying to sleep so that I could drive, I couldn't get to sleep. And then Steve would say, "Hey, your turn." And he would go, and I would immediately turn the radio off, and he was out like a light. But the only thing Steve needs to sleep is from the Marines is permission, right? As soon as he wheels up on an airplane, he's asleep. So that was my first project with Steve. Totally a cold situation. And he didn't know who I was or what I did. And that was the beginning of, working with him for the next 25 years.
It should be noted that yesterday he was apart from us, and then we all met for dinner.
Yep.
And he had been on the road 3 hours to go look at a job, and then 3 hours back to meet us for dinner. And you left early, and then I rode back to the hotel with him from dinner. And I got in the car, and he started the truck, and country music was blasting like crazy when I immediately reached over and turned it down, and he looked at me like, "Don't touch my radio." And I was like, "We're not listening to that garbage, and we're not listening to it that loud."
He is a force to be reckoned with. So basically, we're just going to tell some what we think are really cool stories, because, Steve's role in this podcast is all things related to design and high performance and getting the details right. When I first met Steve, he was doing just about all the drawings for high performance Building America production homes. And one of the references for this is that there's a section of the Green Building Encyclopedia on Green Building Advisor that talks about the relationship between architectural design and laying out mechanical systems in production homes. And there's drawings that Steve has done where Kota Ueno is the engineer who's running the energy modeling on these production builder homes. And Steve would do a drawing of what he thought the building was going to look like. And then he would send the drawings to Kota, and Kota would make his comments and send them back. This happened about 6 times where they played like architecture engineer ping pong. And it was, well, Steve, if you do this, I can get this level of performance. And then Steve would incorporate that, say, yeah, but if I've reduced the glazing area a little bit by focusing the glass here, what's the impact of that? And after 6 of these iterations, they had not only the performance of the enclosure perfectly correlated to the mechanical systems, it was all laid out. And it didn't involve architects and engineers using expletives for each other. It was a ping pong process where each was equal. And so I had never worked with an architect before that thought that design was as much about performance as it is appearance or aesthetics.
Same here. I've never had the conversations with other architects that I've had with Steve. I've never had the rapport where I can just say, well, I think this, and the architect actually goes, yeah, that makes sense, especially from a performance standpoint.
The downside is he is such a pain to work with sometimes, right? But we both give Steve like incredible amounts of grace because he really, really brings his A game to pretty much all the projects that he's working on. Another story related to the Wades were a family that owned a production building company in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They were a real key player in the Building America team. And one of the brothers who was working with the dad was pretty much in charge. One of the big problems they had in moving to high performance with these entry-level slab-on-grade homes was they would lay all their domestic water lines into the slab, very carefully insulate them, and then the concrete flatwork guys would come in and just totally trash all the insulation around the lines.
Dragging bar across them, walking on them, everything.
It was so frustrating to them and so their most prominent performance complaint from their homeowners was, we are wasting a crap ton of cooled hot water because the insulation is not working in the slab. It's losing tons of heat, and we're running like 2 or 3 gallons of water before we get anything that's even lukewarm. So they turned to Steve, who was working for Building Science Corporation, but did a lot of the designs for artistic homes. And they said, hey, Steve, what if we told you that every home that you design for us from here on out has to have 20 feet or less for every hot water run? And there was this pause, and Steve said, oh, that's just another design constraint. If you tell me I have to do that, I'll just make sure that all designs have runs to the bathrooms, to the kitchen, and to the laundry room that are 20 feet or less. And at that time, almost all of their designs, the hot water tank was in the back corner of the garage. And so Steve simply had to work out the layout of the kitchen, the laundry room, and the baths to get that 20 foot or less. Now, you and I know that most architects would say, are you effing crazy? Yeah. That's just not possible. But Steve's attitude is, it's a design constraint. And that's the way he treats everything.
If you make something a priority, you'll design around it. The same way earlier when we were talking about what we were going to talk about, you said powder bath. And I've heard him say that before. Like, if you wouldn't design a house without a powder bath if the clients asked for a powder bath. Well, the clients are asking you to not make the runs longer than 20 feet.
So it's pretty easy for an architect to take an interior design constraint, like you have to have a powder room, right? That you have to build it into design.
They have no problem going, okay, fine, I'll find room for a powder bath.
I'm an architect, I can do that. But with Steve, he translated that into constraints that are performance-based. And that's totally, Steve's the first one to admit this. Steve was a really young architect when he went to work for Joe and Betsy. And Betsy is an architect, Joe is an engineer, and they've got to figure out how to accommodate the skills of an architect with the skills of an engineer. Because on most projects, those people simply either don't talk to each other or disdainfully. It's like, those architects. So he really, from a very young age, was being trained to have performance issues be as important as aesthetic issues.
I think there's also in him, I think there's also a maturity that he brought to the table when he went to school and when he started his career, that like he had already had 4 years in the real world, being in the military and growing up, that like he didn't just start out in school and think that he was just going to be an artist, right, as an architect. Like he had some real world experience. He had some life experience. And I'm not saying that to disparage architects. Like he did have a different perspective, and it was something different to him. And then he immediately went to Building Science Corp, and he didn't just start drawing pretty buildings. And so he has a different path that led him to then starting to design buildings on his own. And I think it shows in his experience that led him to getting to the point where he starts drawing buildings for, say, my clients.
You've probably heard this story, but and some of these stories, I believe them to be true.
They might be.
They may be a little bit different because of my memory, but the way I remember Steve telling the story about how he ended up going to school in architecture was in part because he worked for a pretty high placed general for most of his career in the military. And when he was done with his tour of duty and he wasn't re-enlisting, the general said, "Tell me what you want to do, and I'll do my best to make it happen." And Steve said, "Well, I really want to be a fighter pilot." And the guy said, "Okay, we'll get lined up for that." And here's how I remember it, that Steve is 6'8", and that is like the very, very limit of fitting into a fighter pilot seat. And so that was going to be an issue. And I think he met his wife, Holly, at around the same time. So he always talks wistfully about, hey, what if I had, gone on to be a fighter pilot? But then when he decided that he wanted to go to architecture school, that was part of, meeting Holly and moving to a sort of new phase of his life. And then he went to Wentworth Institute in Boston, where he had a key professor that, kind of hooked him up with Building Science Corporation. So I'm just going to go through the sort of the stories I remember about how Steve has incorporated performance into design. The Wades built a lot of really simple entry-level homes in Santa Fe, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And a key element of that was moving ducts into conditioned space. So you got 4 stair systems. It's so tempting to go up into that attic and say, "Ollie, Ollie in free," and just start tossing ducts willy-nilly. Of course, now you've got your ducts and your equipment outside of conditioned space. And so Steve was in part responsible, I think maybe even solely responsible, for saying, well, hey, we're doing like 8 or 9 foot ceilings throughout the house. What if we just had a central corridor off of which most of the rooms in the house fed? So he's talking about, largely the bathrooms and the bedrooms in these smaller homes. And he said, what if we just drop the ceiling in this common hallway? And so we'll feed supply into all the rooms by dropping that ceiling. And then that drop ceiling becomes where we run all the ducts.
Yep.
So high. And they even went so far as, and I have a picture of this, where the mechanical contractor, the HVAC contractor, said, well, what we can do then is at the end of the hallway, there's going to be a closet, and probably the mechanical closet. He said, what we'll do is we'll build that wall, but set it aside. And then we'll do the whole plenum on sawhorses so we can get everything completely sealed down on the sawhorses and insulated. And then we'll just lift it up and then slide the wall in underneath on the end. So the duct was in conditioned space. It was perfectly sealed, and it led into the supplies for all the rooms.
Nice.
Yeah, just
not terribly complicated.
No, that's right. Simple, elegant answers to the design issues. So The other thing I wanted to mention is that, and again, this is how I remember the story. Joe and Betsy sent Steve out to work with a production builder in California, really big production builder. And Steve was going to work with their staff of architects. This is probably somewhere between 24 and 40 architects. And he was going to do a 2-day training on how to incorporate forced air systems into their designs. And so, this is pretty early on in Steve's career. He maybe was a little bit, nervous going out and talking in front of a bunch of architects. But the story goes that Steve calls back at the end of the first day and he says, I think I'm going to catch a flight out. And Betsy's like, what do you mean? You're only halfway done the training. He goes, no, I'm pretty much done. They walked out of the training. And Betsy said, what do you mean they walked out? They said,
I've never cleared a room. I'm glad I've never cleared a room.
Well, and what happened was they turned to him pretty much without exception and said, this is not architecture. This is drafting, this is laying out framing things. That's not architecture, because in order to accommodate the different size ducts, keep the ducts in conditioned space, you have to plan for that. And the way that you plan for that is you do framing plans and you show whether it's going to be 2x10s or, other framing systems that you can do cutouts for a 6-inch duct, but not an 8-inch duct. And these are all things like, what are you talking about? This is not architecture.
That's for the engineer to draw.
That's for the engineer to draw up. And I'll never forget that I was working on a job, may have been with Steve, and the HVC contractor was so pissed off because he couldn't connect because the architect hadn't laid out the framing for him. And there was no way for him to get part A of the duct run connected to part B. So he turns to me and he goes, you know what my definition of non-structural is? And I said, no. He goes, anything that's in my effing way, right? I mean, You've left him no choice. So that's the kind of things where that many architects would consider that drudgery.
Yeah.
Like, I got to do the layouts for the framing.
And any builder would go, I need to know this. It's important.
And the framer is not going to lay it out to accommodate the HV. It's got to be done by design. And that's a large part of when he and Coda would bounce things back and forth. Steve would say, okay, I remember the first project we worked on was in Cleveland. It was kind of these long shotgun townhouses, or it may have been single family detached. And Steve showing me the framing. And rather than doing, a central bearing beam in the basement and running off, along the short dimension, he says, no, we're going to do 3 bearing beams this way. And I thought, that doesn't make any sense. Why don't you just do it the way that everybody else does it? And he goes, yeah, well, if I do that center beam like that, that center beam is going to separate wherever the mechanical system is and not be able to get to the other half of the building. And I thought, I have never thought to lay out framing to accommodate forced air. Now, part of that is because in the Northeast, we don't have a lot of forced air.
No.
So you don't have those issues. But in large parts of the country, man, it's forced air. And those are big bad boys you got to figure out to work in.
I just thought of, I think that now people are starting to see his impact on the industry because of the work with the Build Show and because of, dare I say, the podcast and the stuff that he's putting on YouTube and everything. But because of Building Science Corp and because of GBA, he's been a force in the industry for 2 decades now. And it was just a little more subversive, 20 years ago. The first time that he convinced me to present was in 2016, and it was at EBA.
Oh, no kidding.
And I went, and it was only the second time that I'd ever been to EBA. But he was like, hey, let's go listen to this guy talk. He's from the DOE. It might be interesting. And it was kind of like, he said that in a very flippant way, like it might be interesting. And I was like, oh, is he going to make fun of this guy? And I thought, okay, I'll go.
Yep.
He very rarely says we should listen to this person talk.
Right.
And he took a stance and we went. And I was staring at the screen, and the guy was talking about a detail, and I looked at the detail, and I looked at Steve, and he was looking down at he was writing something, and I nudged him, and he looked up, and he cocked his head, and then his hand went up immediately, and he said, "Where'd you get that detail?" And I'm purposely not saying who the person presenting was.
Yeah.
And the guy presenting just said something to the effect of like, "Oh, I pulled it from online."
Yeah.
And then like 3 slides later, Steve put his hand up again and said, "Where did you get that detail?" And he's again said, I think I just pulled it from online. And then he said, "Why do you ask?" And Steve said, "It would be great if you were going to use, I don't know, 10 of my details in your presentation if I would get credit." And it was like he had went and just pulled a ton of stuff from GBA. Yeah. And people don't realize that like whatever it was, 1,600 details that you guys worked out for the beginning of GBA.
It was about 1,000 or so.
Yeah. That like they're all from you and him and Gerton. And like there's somebody that's pretty high up at the DOE presenting at EBA just using all of his drawings with no credit. And I was just like, oh, that was why he wanted to go, was because he was planning on picking at that person.
You know, I remember the approximate time when he shifted from, "I am so angry that they're all using my details too." And I think it was a conversation he had with a client about innovation. And I think the client basically just said, "Let it go." Yeah. You know, if you try to stop this, you are going to be so frustrated and ineffectual. Like, just let it go. Yeah. Take it as a compliment. And that was a huge step for Steve. And I think it was a real smart one, because his attitude is you're never going to be able to enforce that. It can't sound like a copyright or anything.
Yep.
So he wants credit for the details, but he also understands that.
Yeah, there's too many of them out there for him to ever.
And he's got so much stuff out there at this point that, you know, there are a lot of things that are sort of de facto attached to Steve.
He also fell asleep in that presentation. He encouraged me to present. I asked him not to come because I was nervous. And then he fell asleep and snored.
You know, when we did the home building crossroads together for such a long time, he would say, he would be asleep in the back while I was presenting. And he'd say, "Well, you got to say something that's interesting to me." And I thought,
don't be boring.
Don't be boring. And I thought, "Steve, I have seen your presentations as many times as you've seen mine, and I'm not asleep in the back of the room."
Yeah.
But I did want to say that when Steve left Building Science Corporation to work with Nathan and I on the 3D building solutions, which ultimately didn't work out, but a lot of that was because if you wanted to be successful as a small startup firm with an architect, a pulmonary doctor who knew building science, and me, sort of the green building weenie, it was going to do a lot of travel. And I remember coming home just before Christmas one year, and I had been gone for more than 3 weeks straight. And I came home, and for the first time, I watched the household work perfectly fine without me. And I called my brother Nathan that night and I said, "I'm done. You know, if we can't figure out how to do this business with less travel, I'm going to have to figure something out." And to Nathan's credit, you know, we talked it through with, and I don't know if Steve said I'm kind of in a similar situation because his kids are a little bit older than mine. But after that, you know, working so intensely with him at Building Science Corporation and then in 3D Building Solutions for 2.5 years or so, we didn't have a whole lot of contact. But Steve is the one that kept in contact by calling me up at Building Green and saying, "Hey, you know, we should do some stuff that we can put on Building Green's website about, you know, high performance buildings and high performance buildings assemblies." So I went to Nadav and Alex at Building Green, of the other principals, and said, "You know, Steve wants to work with us." And I said, "Let's make him like at that time, Building Green had editorial advisors, and there were like a dozen of them." And I said, let's add Steve. And that led to Steve and I doing a whole bunch of written content, webinars that Steve took the lead, and he created details at no charge to Building Green that were part of Steve's I think dedication to building his business, but also like the industry needs these, you know?
Yeah.
And I attribute that to Joe and Betsy, because Joe and Betsy always took the approach that, yes, we need to make money, but this is about moving the industry. And maybe Steve would have had that attitude without Joe and Betsy, but I think a big influence on both Steve and me is the fact that you got to make money in this business, but you owe it to the industry to give back what you've learned.
Yeah.
I did have, I think, one more particular story, and now I'm not remembering which one it is. I think it was the work that we did going into the 1,000 details that were posted on Green Building Advisor. That was essentially Dan Morrison's vision, that we needed to have a really, really good detail library, and let's go get Steve to do those. So Steve, along with all the other work he was doing, just kept pounding out details. You know, I mean, a lot of you folks know this, but he just gets in a groove at his desk, and he will have butt to the chair for 10 or 12 hours straight, just cranking out product or details. So we give a lot of ribbing about Steve, but we thought we'd take this opportunity to just say there's just not that many architects out there, although I think Steve is responsible for creating a lot more architects that have these capabilities. Because if we don't have them, some of the most effective, least expensive ways to do better performing buildings is at the design phase. And they're not sexy. They're not, super cool. They're just simple, elegant performance constraints that you put into design. So now, Steve, we're going to shift to all the dirt on Steve.
If it reads from time to time that he's like acting like he's kind of a jerk, he is. He is kind of a jerk from time to time. It happens.
Aren't we all, maybe?
Hey, easy. We're talking about Steve. I'm going to leave it at that. He's kind of a jerk sometimes.
So Steve doesn't know we're doing this episode, but it's what happens when
he would if he were here. If he had showed up on time, he would know that, wouldn't he?
That's pretty much the deal.
And there he is. He's outside the window and he can see us and hear us now. So you can hear him. He's yelling from the other room. I think on that, we should wrap it up. Okay.
If you have comments about Steve that you'd like to share with us, please send them to the
questions at unbuilditpodcast.com. And thank you for listening today. Have a good day.
Take care.